Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping right into Episode 7, Life in the Trenches. And look, we're going way past the strategic maps and dates you probably remember from history class. We are diving into the raw, absolutely unfiltered reality of daily survival for a World War I soldier out on the Western Front. Let's start with kind of a crazy thought. How do you survive a war when the mud is literally as deadly as the bullets? Because before a single shot was even fired, these guys faced an absolute environmental horror. The environment wasn't just, a backdrop. It was an active, merciless enemy that every single soldier had to battle day in and day out. All right, Section 1, bogged down in mud. When the initial war of movement failed to bring a quick victory, both sides just dug in, and they kept digging. Eventually, these defensive trenches stretched for a staggering 470 kilometers. That is a massive network of earth and barbed wire running all the way from the Belgian coast straight down to the Swiss border. It was a pretty clear signal to everyone that, hey, this war, it's not ending anytime soon. Now, let's look at the daily grind. In military theory, a soldier's schedule was supposed to be pretty balanced. 4 days on the front line, 4 days in reserve, and 4 days resting. Sounds totally reasonable, right? Well, the agonizing reality of the Western Front was completely different. Soldiers frequently spent more than 2 weeks straight trapped on the absolute front line. Just try to imagine the sheer exhaustion of being stuck at the edge of combat, endlessly, with absolutely zero relief. What's really interesting here is how grand strategy trickled right down to daily survival. The trench experiences actually weren't identical for both sides. The German trenches, they were deeper, stronger, well-built. Eventually, they were even reinforced with concrete. And the reason for that is they'd already captured a lot of territory and were basically playing defense. The Allies, on the other hand, were stuck in these shallow, makeshift, and really deadly ditches because their whole priority was pushing the Germans back. I mean, why build a permanent fortress if your goal is to advance tomorrow, right? But as we know, tomorrow rarely came. Moving on to Section 2, Rats, Lice, and Disease. I want you to try and imagine the sensory nightmare of winter in these trenches. The combination of wet, freezing mud led straight to trench foot. This was a completely debilitating condition caused by the inescapable damp and cold that literally caused the skin to rot. It led to gangrene and, tragically, amputation all too often. Winter didn't just bring enemy bullets, it brought severe frostbite that basically turned the ground itself into a medical hazard. But freezing mud wasn't the only uninvited guest. So what else was sharing these tight quarters with them? Well, the soldiers were definitely never alone. They were absolutely tormented by enormous rats, and these rats grew incredibly fat on discarded food and, horribly, the bodies of the dead, spreading disease everywhere. Then you had the constant, maddening agony of tiny lice. The soldiers called them cooties. They lived in their clothing, sucked their blood, and left the men just covered in scabs and sores. Oh, and when winter finally broke, summer brought its own nightmare. The blazing heat made the stench of the field latrines and decaying bodies absolutely unbearable. Let's shift gears to Section 3, Scrounging for Daily Rations. Food is fuel, but out there, it was rarely a comfort. For the Allies, especially early on for the American forces, their diet relied heavily on this really monotonous British corned beef and hardtack, which they'd boil into a super bland stew. Meanwhile, on the German side, severe food shortages caused by the British naval blockade led to ersatz, or substitute foods. We're talking acorns and beech nuts instead of coffee, and turnips taking the place of potatoes. Because of this totally dismal fare, soldiers on both sides became expert scroungers, just foraging through the countryside for fresh eggs, a loaf of bread, or a little bit of cheese. That became a thrilling distraction just to break up the miserable routine. And get this, simply getting a drink of water could literally be a deadly mission. Extreme water shortages were a daily reality on the front lines. You couldn't just, drink from a local stream because the environment itself was completely contaminated by poison gas and chemical weapons. Because of that, these bulky, incredibly heavy water containers had to be hand-carried right up to the forward trenches under the cover of darkness. Which brings us to Section 4, the psychological toll. Caught between the sheer, grinding boredom of a long stalemate and the sudden, overwhelming terror of unexpected artillery strikes, the human mind was just under constant assault. This relentless pressure gave rise to the term shell shock. That was the phrase used at the time for the profound mental breakdowns, basically what we now understand as PTSD, triggered by the concussive force and pure psychological terror of the artillery bombardments. To truly grasp what that felt like, listen to this visceral firsthand account from an American 1st Division soldier caught in a barrage. Quote, "I saw a wall of fire. The air was filled with mud, water, pieces of duckboard, and shell splinters. As I dodged to shelter, the concussion from one blast knocked me forward on my face. Before I could get up, I was half burned by another explosion." End quote. I mean, wow. That puts you directly into the intense personal reality of the front line, doesn't it? The sheer kinetic violence was inescapable. Let's wrap up our journey with Section 5, Brotherhood and the Truce. Yet, incredibly, these men found ways to endure. Soldiers coped by developing their own distinct trench culture, turning to dark humor and comradeship to survive. A brilliant example of this is a paper called The Wipers Times. British soldiers actually found an abandoned printing press and produced their own satirical trench newsletter right there in the combat zone. It was packed with inside jokes, gallows humor, and subversive comments about the war. It really acted as this vital psychological shield against all the madness around them. There were also these really profound moments of external care that lifted morale. Contrast the immense darkness of the front lines with the incredible light of groups like the Salvation Army, who set up aid stations right in the reserve trenches. You literally had American civilians risking their own lives, wearing gas masks and helmets just like the troops, making hot coffee and frying up fresh donuts right there while the shells were flying. For a soldier, that was a brief, amazing taste of home in the middle of hell. And of course, we absolutely have to mention the legendary 1914 Christmas truce. Along certain parts of the Western Front, spontaneous singing and even soccer matches broke out between British and German forces right in the middle of no man's land. So the really crucial takeaway here is this. Even amidst industrialized mass slaughter, opposing sides could pause. They could actually look across the barbed wire and recognize their shared humanity, even if it was just for a brief holiday moment. So I want to leave you with this final poignant question. When surrounded by mud, disease, and relentless shelling, how does the human spirit still find a way to sing? It is a profound testament to the unbelievable resilience of those who lived in the trenches of the First World War. Think on that and keep exploring. We'll catch you in the next explainer.